I'm Marcel, and welcome to me screaming into the void, mostly about books. In June of 2024, I'm doing the Amazing Race readathon, and that year, or this year, depending on what year you are watching this in, it's divided into genres. Now, there were 5 genres to pick from. There was literary fiction, romance, fantasy, horror, and science fiction. And I am joining the science fiction team. The reason I'm joining the science fiction team is because I usually read literary fiction, which you would know if you watch a lot of the videos on my channel. In addition to that, I read a lot of fantasy when I was younger, and I wanted to use this readathon to read a bit outside of my comfort zone. But what is science fiction? Now, any try at categorization will say more about the categorizer than the category itself. But still, if I'm going to do this, I need to then define and categorize what I think defines science fiction as a genre. And there is no hard or loose definition that is going to perfectly encompass all of the science fiction books and exclude all of the science fiction books. Again, categorization tells more about the categorizer than anything else. So there are of course going to be exceptions to the rule, otherwise there wouldn't be any rules. But this is more of a guideline for me to talk about science fiction. Science fiction as a genre can be understood in a lot of different ways, as genres generally can be understood in a lot of different ways. And genre is very often a tool to be used in different ways. Mostly common when it comes to genres within the bookish sphere and film sphere is very often about selling something to a consumer, so either a reader or a viewer. And therefore, very often, if you go to a bookshop, they will talk about genre in regard to, are there a romance story? Are there fantasy elements? Is it about technology? Is it set in the future? Is it set in the past? What kind of tropes will you encounter? But if you've seen some of the videos on my channel, the context that I would describe it as isn't really what's important to me. And therefore, when I'm talking about genre, I'm talking more about science fiction stories rather than science fiction settings. So you can have a setting with a lot of technology or on other planets or on a spacecraft without necessarily that story definitely being a science fiction story. When I'm then talking about a science fiction story, and I'm talking about the story, not the setting, not the plot, but a story, what kinds of stories are we then talking about? Very often, science fiction is described as speculative genres. And speculative genres are genres that ask a what-if question. Now, the most common speculative genres are science fiction, fantasy, and horror. What if this scientific thing happened? What if this magical thing happened? And what if this scary thing happened? So horror is very often easy to define. Horror books has a function, they're trying to scare you. And that's why you can, for example, see a writer like Stephen King, who has books with fire starters and demons, or just bipolar psychopaths, and you can still recognize all of them within one genre with the function of what if something scary happens. But separating fantasy and science fiction is much more difficult in a lot of ways, and I'm not using that to be pedantic. A lot of people tries to figure out what is the separation between fantasy what if and science fiction what if. And one of the reasons I think between why it's so difficult to separate the fantasy what if with scientific what if is partly because, well, what defines something as a scientific what if or a magical what if? A lot of magic systems are based on rules and guidelines and natural laws that, while different from what we have on Earth, how is that any different from being on another planet necessarily? Or you have the issue of the scientific in regard to hard scientific and soft scientific. For example, like a book like 1984 that a lot of people would define as science fiction, but isn't really centered around technology in and of itself. And then you of course have the aspect of technology that might not be so defined, and in the future, as Arthur C. Clarke puts it, that technology can very quickly in the future seem like magic, because we are struggling with understanding what is actually possible or not possible. And especially this also has to do with, well, how do we know what is possible or not possible? Or the books and book tropes within science fiction that all laws of nature tells us that shouldn't be possible. For example, time travel, but it is still very much acknowledged as a trope you will find within a lot of science fiction books. So this simple question of what if this magical thing happens as definition of fantasy, and what if this technological thing happens or scientific thing happens that you find in science fiction, isn't that simple to separate. So how will you then know and understand fantasy from science fiction? And therefore we have to go back to the whole speculative question. If science fiction as speculative fiction is asking the question, what if? What is the question they are very often asking? If you're talking about the most common scientific books recognized as scientific by most people talking about book genres, there is one more thing, and probably more of that aspect, that these books have in common than anything else, and that is that they are set in the future, commenting on the future. And when I'm saying commenting on the future, I don't necessarily mean in a bleak way, but you, for example, have iRobot with Isaac Asimov, and The Neuromancer with William Gibson, who asks the question, in the future, when we get AI, will that be a positive or a positive neutral thing or a negative thing? You have books like Oryx and Crix that asks the question, in a future where we do get biological scientific breakthroughs, how will that impact a world where not all bodies are seen as equal? Or you can have stories, for example, like H.G. Wells' War of the World, that asks the question, if we are going to be invaded by an alien race in some time in the future, will that alien race treat us as we, the British, has treated other countries? So while they are set in the future, while they are commenting on what if this thing happens in the future, they can still use the questions set in the future to comment on what is happening in the present. So, my definition of a science fiction book hasn't really so much to do with the technology in and of itself, but has more to do with how we can use talking about the future as a way of commenting the present. If we are enjoying the way we are going forward, or if the future seems like a bleak place. So now, as I started, having created this genre, you probably know a lot more about me than you do about science fiction. But I'm very interested to know what you think. How would you define science fiction? Is it different from films, from books? What are the examples that you would say this is absolutely science fiction, but doesn't really fit the category that either you or I describe as science fiction? Let's talk about this. Categorizing is fun, as long as we understand that it means more revealing about us than it does about anything else. Thank you for listening to me screaming into the void.